The air in early May of '72 hung thick and wet, heavy with the smell of turned earth and the promise of a planting season that felt different. You could feel it in the way the old men talked at the co-op, a nervous energy buzzing under the usual complaints about the price of seed corn. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the starter's pistol. For Jedediah Stone, that pistol shot sounded like a rifle crack. He was halfway down the gravel road, bordering the old Henderson place when he saw it. Tom Henderson's Oliver 1850, its green paint faded to the color of a dried-out pond, was stopped dead in the middle of a pass. A plume of blue-white smoke, thick as a winter fog, billowed from under the hood and hung motionless in the humid air. Jed eased his '68 Ford F-250 to a stop, the gravel crunching under the worn tires. The truck's 390 V8 rumbled a low, steady rhythm, a familiar comfort against the sudden silence from the field. Jed swung his lean frame out of the cab. He was a man built of wire and leather, not much for talk, with hands that looked more like tools than flesh. Grease was etched so deep into the lines of his palms and knuckles that no soap could ever wash it clean. He vaulted the ditch, his worn work boots sinking slightly into the soft black soil. Tom Henderson was standing beside his tractor, hat in his hands, staring at the engine with the hollow look of a man who'd just watched his life savings catch fire. The smell hit Jed from 20 feet away. Not just hot oil, but the acrid metallic stench of catastrophic failure. "Through a rod, Tom?" Jed asked, his voice low and calm. Tom just nodded, wiping a hand over his face. "Sounded like a shotgun blast right under my feet, Jed. Just boom. Then nothing." Jed leaned over, peering into the engine bay. The side of the Waukesha block was no longer a smooth cast surface. A jagged fist-sized hole had been punched clean through, and a bent connecting rod, glistening with fresh oil, was sticking out like a broken bone. The ground beneath was already black with the engine's lifeblood. It was as bad as it gets. Before another word could be said, a cloud of dust appeared at the far end of the road, moving fast. It resolved into a brand-new two-tone Chevrolet Silverado, gleaming with chrome and a coat of wax so thick it looked wet. The truck slid to a stop behind Jed's Ford, and Warren Bishop stepped out. Warren was the opposite of Jed in every way. His shirt was clean, his boots were for show, and his hands were soft. He'd inherited the biggest farm in Providence County, and had spent the last 5 years leveraging it to the hilt, buying up every parcel that came for sale. He wasn't a farmer, he was a businessman who happened to deal in corn and soybeans. "Well, well, Tom," Warren said, his voice slick with false sympathy as he sauntered over. He didn't look at the broken engine, he looked at the whole tractor with disdain. "Looks like the old girl finally gave up the ghost. I told you that museum piece belonged in a scrapyard 3 years ago." Tom flinched, but said nothing. "Tell you what," Warren continued, pulling a pristine handkerchief from his pocket and dabbing at a bead of sweat on his temple. "I'll have my new International 1066 over here tomorrow. We can finish planting this field for you. Cost you a little, of course, but better than letting it go to weeds. Then you can haul this junker into the dealer and see if they'll give you $500 on a trade for a new one. I hear the bank's offering great financing terms right now." Jed straightened up, wiping his hands on an old red rag he pulled from his back pocket. He looked from the hole in the engine block to Warren's smug face. "He doesn't need a new tractor, Warren. He needs a new engine block." Warren let out a short, barking laugh. "A new block? Jed, you can't be serious. The parts for this relic probably don't even exist anymore. And the labor. My God, it would cost more than the whole tractor is worth. You're living in the past. It's all about efficiency now. Uptime. You trade in, you trade up. Let the bank carry the note. That's how you grow." Jed just shook his head slowly. "You don't own a tractor the bank has a note on, Warren. The bank owns it. You just get to make the payments." That was the gulf between them, wider than the Missouri River. Jed still farmed the 320 acres his father had paid off in 1958. He did it with a John Deere 4020 side console he'd bought used but in cash, a Farmall M for lighter work, and a combine so old the other farmers joked it ran on prayers instead of diesel. He was the last of a dying breed, a man who believed that if you couldn't hold the title free and clear, you were just a hired hand for a banker in a suit. Warren saw him as a fool, a stubborn old mule refusing to join the race, and the rest of the county was starting to agree with him. These were boom times. Land prices were climbing, grain was king, and credit was cheap. Warren was the future, Jed was a fossil. "Suit yourself, Stone," Warren sneered, turning back to his truck. "You and Tom can play with your rusty toys. I've got a business to run." He drove off, leaving another cloud of dust to settle over the dead Oliver. Jed turned back to Tom. "Let me get my chains. We'll pull her back to my shop. I think I know where I can find a block." Tom looked up, a flicker of hope in his exhausted eyes. "You really think you can fix it, Jed?" "Machinery is just iron, Tom," Jed said, clapping him on the shoulder, "and iron can always be fixed. It just takes time and patience. Not a checkbook." The place Jed had in mind was Miller's Salvage, a 10-acre plot of land that was a graveyard for forgotten iron. It was a place of beautiful decay, where tractors and combines from 3 generations slowly returned to the earth, their steel skeletons picked clean for parts. Old Man Miller knew every bolt on every machine and could tell you the sad story behind most of them. Jed found him by a mountain of old tires, using a torch to cut the hub off a rusted-out Minneapolis Moline. "Looking for a Waukesha block, Miller? Off an 1850, Jed said over the hiss of the torch. Miller shut off the gas and lifted his goggles. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each one filled with fine black dust. "Henderson's," he grunted. "You heard already? News of a blown engine travels faster than a prairie fire in this county," Miller said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice. "Yeah, I got one. Back corner, off a tractor that got wrapped around an oak tree in '69. Block should be good. You'll have to pull it yourself." "That's the way I like it," Jed replied. As he made his way through the rows of mechanical corpses, his eyes caught something. It was huge. So big, in fact, that at first he thought it was a small building covered by a ripped and faded canvas tarp. But the unmistakable shape of 4 gigantic flat tires, each one taller than he was, gave it away. Curiosity got the better of him. He walked over and pulled at a corner of the heavy tarp. The canvas fought him, stiff with age and grime, but it finally gave way, revealing a small section of the machine. The paint was a sun-bleached, chalky yellow, and stenciled on the side in massive faded black letters were 2 words: Big Bud. Jed's breath caught in his throat. He'd heard stories, everyone had. A custom-built monster, ordered by some rich syndicate farmer from out west who went bust before it was even a year old. It had been auctioned off, passed through a few hands, and then disappeared. To see it here, in Miller's boneyard, was like finding a beached whale in a cornfield. He pulled the tarp back further, revealing the enormous articulated frame, the cab with its panoramic glass now cracked and clouded, the sheer scale of the thing. It was a Series 1, an HN 320 maybe, with a Cummins engine that had to be the size of a small car. It was built for a different kind of farming, for 1,000-acre passes on the vast flat plains of Montana, not the rolling hills of Iowa. A sight, ain't she? Miller had walked up behind him, silent as a ghost. Been sitting there for 2 years. Some fella from up north bought it, ran it hard, didn't do the maintenance, spun the main bearings and cooked the turbo. He couldn't afford the repair bill, so he parked it here. Then the bank took his land and told me I could have the tractor for the cost of the haul. Jed ran a hand over the cold, rusted steel of the fender. The scale was hard to comprehend. His 4020 would look like a toy next to it. "What's wrong with it?" "Engine's shot," Miller said flatly. "Total rebuild, and not the kind of rebuild you do in a farm shop. We're talking machine work, line boring, a new crank maybe. Parts a special order, if you can even find them. It'd cost $20,000 just to get it breathing again. Nobody's crazy enough to take that on." Jed stared at the sleeping giant. He saw the rust, the flat tires, the dead engine. But he also saw something else. He saw 320 horsepower of raw mechanical honesty. He saw a machine built of simple, heavy steel, without a circuit board or a computer in sight. It was a monument to a different way of thinking. In a world that was falling in love with financing and disposable machinery, this broken titan felt more real, more permanent than Warren Bishop's entire fleet of shiny bank-owned tractors. Warren was borrowing against the future, This tractor, this magnificent wreck, was a piece of the past, waiting for someone with enough patience to give it a future again. And that brings me to a question for all of you watching this. Before we go any further into Jed's story, I want you to think about it. We've all seen them, sitting out there in a forgotten corner of a farm or hidden in the back of a salvage yard. A piece of machinery that was once the king of the fields, now left to the weeds and the rust. What's the biggest, most impressive piece of forgotten iron you've ever laid eyes on? Was it an old Steiger, a versatile, or maybe one of these legendary big buds? Drop a comment down below and tell me about it. I read every single one, and I love hearing those stories. Jed spent the next 3 days in a state of greasy nirvana. He and Tom used an A-frame hoist and a chain fall to pull the dead engine from the Oliver. Then they went back to Miller's and did the same for the donor block, 2 men straining against the sheer mass of cast iron. Back in Jed's shop, the real work began. The donor block was sound, but it wasn't perfect. Jed spent a full day cleaning it, scrubbing out the sludge-filled oil passages with rifle brushes, checking the deck with a straight edge to make sure it hadn't warped. He took the crankshaft and cylinder head from Tom's original engine, as they'd survived the failure. He drove them 60 miles to the only machine shop in the region that still knew how to work on this old stuff. They magnafluxed the parts, checking for microscopic cracks the naked eye couldn't see. The crank needed to be turned 0.010 of an inch undersize on the rod journals, which meant new bearings. While the parts were at the shop, Jed was back in his own, honing the cylinder walls of the donor block. He used a ball hone on his heavy-duty electric drill, the rhythmic zzzz of the tool echoing in the cavernous shed. He worked the hone up and down in each of the 6 cylinders, creating the perfect crosshatch pattern that would allow the new piston rings to seat properly and hold compression. He measured the bore with his telescoping gauges and a micrometer, checking for taper and out of round. He was a surgeon, and this engine block was his patient. The talk at the diner, as always, turned to farming. Warren Bishop held court from his usual booth, bragging about the speed of his planting. "We put in 160 acres of corn yesterday," Warren announced to the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That 1066 is a beast, pulled the 12-row planter like it wasn't even there. At this rate, I'll be done by the weekend." "How about you, Jed?" he called out, spotting Jed sitting alone at the counter. Jed didn't look up from his coffee. "Still working on Tom Henderson's Oliver." A few of the younger farmers chuckled. "Still messing with that junker?" one of them asked. "Warren's right, Jed. You gotta know when to cut your losses." "It's not a loss," Jed said, finally turning on his stool. His voice was quiet, but carried a weight that made the men lean in. "It's a repair. There's a difference." "The difference," Warren interjected, "is that I'm making money, and you're wasting time." "Time is money, Jed. That's the first rule of modern farming." "The first rule of farming," Jed countered, his eyes locking with Warren's, "is to not spend money you don't have. The rest is just details." He dropped a few coins on the counter, nodded to the waitress, and walked out, leaving a tense silence in his wake. He finished the Oliver a week later. With the new bearings plastic-aged to a perfect clearance and the head torqued down in the proper sequence, the moment of truth arrived. Jed had primed the oil system, turning the engine over with the fuel shutoff pulled until he saw pressure on the gauge. He pushed the knob in and hit the starter. The Waukesha diesel coughed once, twice, then roared to life, settling into a smooth, powerful idle. The sound was sweeter to Jed than any symphony. Tom Henderson was so grateful he tried to pay Jed for his labor, but Jed refused. "Just pay me for the parts and the machine shop bill," he said. "Neighbors help neighbors. That's how it's supposed to work." But that summer, Jed's own iron tested his philosophy. It was late July, the corn was tasseling, and the heat was oppressive. Jed was cultivating his soybean fields with the 4020, the big diesel engine humming its familiar tune, when the hydraulics started to whine. It was a high-pitched, strained sound that meant something was starving for oil. A moment later, the steering got heavy and the cultivator arms refused to lift. He shut it down in the field and checked the hydraulic fluid. The dipstick was bone dry. A quick look underneath confirmed his fears. The main hydraulic pump, buried deep in the tractor's belly, had blown a seal. A steady stream of expensive high-guard fluid was dripping onto the hot transmission case, sizzling and smoking. It was a nightmare of a job. He had to split the tractor, separating the engine from the transmission just to get to the pump. It took him a full day of wrestling with massive bolts and carefully placing floor jacks and blocking. He rolled the front half of the tractor away, exposing the machine's guts. The pump was right there, but replacing the seal wasn't the hard part. The hard part was that the failed seal had sent fine metal shavings throughout the entire hydraulic system. The steering, the brakes, the rock shaft for the three-point hitch. He spent the next 3 nights after his day's work was done, flushing the system. He drained every drop of contaminated oil, refilled it with cheap flushing oil, ran the tractor for 10 minutes and drained it again. He did this 5 times until the oil came out clean. Each time he cleaned the suction screen, picking out the tiny glittering specks of metal that could destroy a new pump in minutes. It was tedious, frustrating work that left him exhausted and soaked in oil and sweat. All the while, Warren Bishop would drive by on the main road, his air-conditioned pickup a cool bubble of comfort, and slow down just enough to watch Jed toiling away in the sweltering heat. He never stopped, just offered a pitying shake of his head before speeding off. To Warren, it was just more proof. Jed's way was the way of failure, of endless, pointless labor. The years began to tick by. 1973, 1974, the world outside of Providence County was changing in ways the farmers only heard about on the radio. An oil embargo, soaring inflation. But for them, it was the golden age. In 1972, a deal was struck where the United States would sell massive quantities of grain to the Soviet Union. They called it the Great Grain Robbery on the news, but in the heartland, it was a gold rush. The price of corn, which had been just over $1 a bushel, shot up to $3, then $4. Soybeans followed suit. Suddenly, every farmer was rich on paper. The Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, became a folk hero. His message was simple and seductive. Plant fence row to fence row. Get big or get out. And Warren Bishop took that message to heart. He bought the Henderson place when Tom finally retired. Then he bought the old Miller farm. He was farming nearly 2,000 acres now. His 1066 was traded in for a brand new IH 1466, its dual smokestacks gleaming. Then he added another, and a massive 4-wheel drive Steiger Panther II for the heavy tillage. He built a new harvestor silo that towered over the landscape, a big blue monument to his success. He built a machine shed the size of a gymnasium to house his fleet. Every piece of it, from the land to the tractors to the bins, was bought with the bank's money. The local loan officer treated him like royalty. Warren was the king of Providence County, and he looked the part. He drove a new Cadillac Eldorado and took his wife on a vacation to Hawaii. At the diner, he no longer argued with Jed. He simply ignored him, treating him as an irrelevant, pitiable ghost from a bygone era. The other farmers followed his lead. They saw Warren's new iron, his expanding acreage, and they saw the future. They saw Jed, still running his same old 40-20, and they saw a man who was too scared or too stupid to grab his piece of the pie. Jed, however, was playing a different game. The high grain prices were good for him too. His profits tripled. But he didn't leverage them. He didn't call the loan officer. The first thing he did was pay off the last small operating note his father had taken out years ago. For the first time in its 100-year history, the Stone Farm was completely, totally, 100% debt-free. There wasn't a bank in the world that had a claim on a single acre of his land or a single bolt on his machinery. He used the rest of the money methodically. He put a new steel roof on the main barn. He replaced all the old wiring in the house. He bought the best hybrid seed corn and fertilizer, paying cash on the barrelhead and getting a hefty discount. The rest, a significant sum, he put into U.S. savings bonds and a simple passbook savings account at the bank, the same bank that was financing Warren's empire. Then, one cool afternoon in the fall of '75, he drove his old Ford F-250 back to Miller's salvage. The big bud was still there, looking even more forlorn than it had 3 years prior. The tires had sunk deeper into the mud, and weeds were climbing up its giant frame. Jed found Miller wrestling with the transmission from a Massey Ferguson. "You still want a fortune for that yellow monster?" Jed asked without preamble. Miller grunted, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy glove. "I don't want a fortune. I want it gone. It's taking up too much space, but I ain't giving it away. The scrap value alone on that much steel is worth something." Jed reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He didn't say a word, just handed it to Miller. Miller opened it and thumbed through the stack of $100 bills. He counted it twice, his eyes wide. It was a low number, an insult for a tractor of that size, but it was more cash than he'd seen in one place all year. "It's yours, Jed," Miller said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "But I gotta ask, what in God's name are you gonna do with a 50,000-pound paperweight with a dead engine?" "I'm going to fix it," Jed said simply. Hauling it home was a spectacle. He had to hire a heavy-haul trucking company from Des Moines. The whole town seemed to turn out to watch as the massive, crippled machine was winched onto a lowboy trailer and driven slowly and carefully down the county highway to Jed's farm. The whispers were deafening. Old Man Stone's finally lost his mind. All that money he's been hoarding, and he spends it on that piece of junk. Warren Bishop drove by the procession, shook his head, and laughed out loud. To him and to everyone else, this was the final definitive proof of Jedediah Stone's foolishness. He had sat out the biggest boom in agricultural history only to spend his savings on a worthless mountain of scrap iron. That evening, Jed stood in his shop, the cavernous space now dominated by the sheer bulk of the Big Bud. It filled the main bay, its dirty yellow paint seeming to soak up the dim light from the bare bulbs overhead. The air was cold, and the silence was heavy. He laid a hand on the massive Cummins engine block. It was cold as a tombstone. The task ahead was monumental, almost impossible. Rebuilding an engine this specialized, this massive, was a feat few would even attempt. From a small transistor radio sitting on his workbench, the static-laced voice of a newscaster crackled through the quiet shop. He was talking about the economy, about runaway inflation. He mentioned a name Jed had never heard before. A man named Paul Volcker, who had just been appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve. The announcer spoke of a new, aggressive strategy to fight inflation, a plan that would involve raising interest rates. He said they might have to go up significantly. Jed didn't know much about economics, but he knew what high interest rates did to people who lived on borrowed money. A cold breeze whispered through a crack in the old barn door, and for the first time in a long time, Jed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Outside, the world of modern agriculture, financed by cheap and easy credit, was having the party of a lifetime. But here, in the quiet of his shop, with his hands on the cold, dead steel of the giant tractor, Jed could hear the first faint rumblings of the approaching storm. The work on the Big Bud began not with a wrench, but with a pressure washer. For 2 days, Jed blasted away years of accumulated grease, dirt, and bird droppings, slowly revealing the machine's true form. It was like an archaeological dig, uncovering the fossil of some great beast. Underneath the grime, the steel was pitted and rusted in places, but it was thick, heavy, and honest. He ordered 4 new tires, massive 30.532 diamond treads that had to be delivered on a flatbed truck. The cost was staggering, more than he'd paid for his 4020, but it was a cash purchase. As he and the tire man wrestled them into place with pry bars and a hydraulic jack, the tractor slowly rose from its slumber, standing tall and square on new rubber for the first time in nearly a decade. Then came the engine. The Cummins NTA 855C was a legend, a 14-litre inline-six that powered everything from semi-trucks to generators. This one, however, was a mess. Jed spent a week just dismantling it. Every bolt was a battle. He used a 3/4-inch drive impact wrench that hammered against the rust. And for the biggest fasteners, a 4-foot cheetah bar that made the steel groan in protest. He used an engine hoist to lift the cylinder head, a single piece of cast iron that weighed nearly 500 pounds. The pistons were the size of coffee cans. When he finally pulled them, he found what he'd suspected. The main bearings were spun, scarred with deep grooves, where a lack of oil had allowed metal to grind against metal. The crankshaft was ruined. Sourcing parts was a slow, patient hunt. He found a company in Indiana that specialized in Cummins engines and ordered a rebuild kit with new pistons, liners, rings, and a full set of gaskets. The crankshaft was another story. A new one was impossibly expensive. Jed spent his evenings on the phone, calling salvage yards across the Midwest. He finally located a used, standard-size crank from a burned-out Peterbilt in a yard near Kansas City. He drove the 6 hours down in his Ford, inspected it himself, paid the man in cash, and hauled the 900-pound piece of forged steel home in the truck bed, the leaf springs groaning all the way. He took the block and the used crank to the best heavy-duty machine shop in Omaha. They hot-tanked the block, magna-fluxed it for cracks, and line-bored the mains to ensure they were perfectly true. They polished the crank journals and balanced the entire rotating assembly. It was a massive expense, the single biggest check Jed had ever written. It represented years of careful saving, of forgoing new paint on the barn or a newer pickup truck. When he paid the bill, he felt a pang of fear, but it was followed by a quiet sense of resolve. This was his investment, not in land or futures, but in iron. The reassembly was his sanctuary. Through the winter of 78 and into 79, he worked in the evenings under the harsh glare of shop lights. He installed the new wet sleeve cylinder liners using a special press he built himself. He meticulously checked every bearing clearance with Plastigauge, torqued every bolt in sequence with a massive torque multiplier that clicked like a rifle shot in the quiet barn. He set the injector timing using dial indicators, a slow, precise art that modern mechanics had forgotten. He was building more than an engine. He was breathing life back into a dead giant, one perfectly torqued bolt at a time. Meanwhile, the world outside his shop door was spinning faster and faster. The late 70s were a fever dream of prosperity. Land that had sold for $500 an acre was now fetching $3,000. The bank was handing out money like it was gospel tracts at a revival. Warren Bishop was at the peak of his power. He'd torn down his old farmhouse and built a sprawling brick ranch-style house on a hill overlooking his land. He bought a Cessna airplane and learned to fly, checking his endless fields of corn and soybeans from the air. But then, in the summer of 1980, the sky dried up. A brassy, cloudless dome parked itself over the Midwest and refused to move. The rains stopped in June and did not return. The corn, which had stood so green and proud, began to curl its leaves inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. The tassels emerged weak and pale, shedding pollen onto silks that were already dry and unreceptive. The soybeans simply stopped growing, their pods flat and empty. The drought was the first crack in the foundation. Warren's yields were cut in half. At the same time, the Soviet grain embargo, a response to the invasion of Afghanistan, slammed the door on a massive export market. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of Warren's cash flow projections, collapsed. The first sign of real trouble came when his brand-new International 4386, a big, articulated four-wheel drive he'd bought to replace the Steiger, developed a catastrophic transmission failure. The tractor sat for 3 weeks waiting for a specialized part from the factory. 3 weeks of idle time in the critical fall tillage season while the weeds took root in his fields. The repair bill, when it finally came, was 5 pages long and cost more than Jed's first house. Warren grew thin, his confident swagger replaced by a nervous energy. The loan officer, a man who had once taken him golfing, now only called to talk about payment schedules. The interest rate on his operating notes, once a manageable 9%, had ticked up to 12, then 15. Every percentage point was like another stone loaded onto his back. He was a man walking a high wire, and the wind was starting to blow. The wind became a hurricane in 1981. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, determined to slay the dragon of inflation, cranked interest rates to levels not seen in a century. The prime rate hit an unimaginable 21%. For farmers like Warren, who lived on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His payments didn't just increase, they exploded. The cost of financing his operation suddenly became his single largest expense. More than fuel, more than seed, more than fertilizer. The great machine of credit-fueled agriculture ground to a halt and then began to run in reverse. Land values, which had been the collateral for all that debt, crashed. The $3,000 an acre land was now worth less than $1,000, but the loans were still for $3,000. Suddenly, nearly every farmer who had followed the get big or get out mantra was technically bankrupt. The auction notices started appearing in the paper. At first, it was just one, a small farm on the edge of the county. Then two more. Soon it was a weekly plague. The sounds of the auctioneer's chant became the soundtrack of the crisis, a fast-talking funeral dirge for family farms. Friends and neighbors Jed had known his whole life stood silently in the cold, watching as their lives were sold off piece by piece. Shiny red and green tractors, combines with cabs that still had the new plastic smell, all went for 50 cents on the dollar. The bankers stood at the edge of the crowds, grim-faced men in suits, clipboards in hand, ticking off the assets. Warren Bishop's auction was the biggest the county had ever seen. It was a cold, grey day in November of '82. The entire community turned out, not in celebration, but in a kind of horrified awe, like watching a great ship sink. Jed stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in his pockets. He watched as the IH-1466 were sold, their chrome stacks tarnished. He watched the massive grain bins, empty and echoing, go to a corporate farming outfit from Illinois. He watched as the tools were sold from the shop, the welders, the drill presses, the things a man uses to build and repair. Finally, they auctioned the land itself, parcel by parcel, on the courthouse steps. Warren stood beside his wife, his face as grey as the winter sky, a man hollowed out by his own ambition. The empire he had built on paper and promises had vanished into thin air. Through it all, Jed endured. The low grain prices hurt, but they didn't kill him. His operating costs were a fraction of his neighbors. His fuel bill was his biggest expense. He had no payments to make, no interest to calculate. He lived as he always had, on the food his wife grew in her garden and the meat he raised himself. He was an island of black ink in a sea of red. That spring, in 1983, he finished the Big Bud. With the engine fully assembled, he filled the massive radiator with coolant and the crankcase with 15 gallons of oil. He bled the fuel system, cracking the injector lines one by one until pure, bubble-free diesel dripped out. He climbed into the high cab, the seat cracked and worn. He took a deep breath, turned the key and pushed the starter button. The huge engine turned over slowly, once, twice, fighting against the immense compression of its new parts. A cloud of white smoke puffed from the single, large exhaust stack, then another, and then it caught. It wasn't an explosion of noise, but a deep, world-shaking rumble that started low in the earth and grew into a thundering, rhythmic roar. The whole barn seemed to vibrate with the power of it. The sound rolled across the fields, the sound of 320 horses of pure, mechanical, debt-free power coming to life. Jed let it warm up, his eyes on the oil pressure gauge. It was steady and strong. He eased the clutch in, pulled the transmission into a low gear, and the giant tractor rolled out of the shop and into the sunlight for the first time under its own power. He hitched it to a 30-foot field cultivator he'd bought for scrap value at one of the auctions. In the field, the tractor was magnificent. It pulled the massive implement through the soil as if it were sand, the Cummins engine barely changing its tone, the huge dual tires leaving a perfectly tilled seedbed in their wake. He could prepare more ground in a single afternoon than he used to in 3 days with the 40/20. It was efficiency born not of financing, but of patience and skill. He was one man on one machine he owned completely, doing the work of an entire fleet. The climax came a few weeks later. Jed was working a field that bordered the old Bishop homestead, the original 160 acres that Warren's grandfather had first broken the sod on. The bank had sold off all the new land Warren had acquired, but they couldn't find a buyer for the original farm with its old run-down house and barns. It sat empty, a sad memorial to a shattered dream. As Jed made a pass along the fence line, the Big Bud thundering along, he saw a figure standing by the rusted gate of the old farm. It was Warren. He wasn't driving a Cadillac anymore, he was on foot. He just stood there, watching the huge yellow tractor work. He watched as the machine he had personally laughed at, the machine he had called a worthless piece of junk, effortlessly cultivated the earth. This tractor, bought from a boneyard and rebuilt by the hands of the man he called a fool, was now the undisputed king of the county. It was a symbol of everything he had misunderstood, of every piece of bad advice he had ever given. Jed finished the pass, throttled the big Cummins down to a low idle, and set the brake. The silence that fell was heavy. He climbed down from the cab, his boots sinking into the soft dirt, and walked toward the fence. He and Warren stood there for a long moment, the wire between them seeming to represent the vast gulf that had always separated their philosophies. "She runs good," Warren said finally, his voice raspy. He couldn't look Jed in the eye. "She does," Jed replied. There was no triumph in his voice, only a quiet statement of fact. "I was wrong, Jed," Warren said, the words coming out in a painful rush. "About everything. I built a house of cards. I thought the good times would last forever. I thought you were crazy for hoarding cash and messing with that old iron." He finally looked up, and Jed could see the profound, soul-crushing weight of his failure in his eyes. "Turns out, you were the only sane one in the whole damn county." Jed leaned against a fence post, looking out over the field. He thought about all the years of quiet mockery, of being dismissed and ignored. He could have said 1,000 things, but he didn't. Instead, he looked over at the old Bishop farmhouse, its paint peeling, a few windows broken. "That's good land, Warren," Jed said, nodding toward the field behind the house. "Your granddad picked a good spot. Good drainage, lays nice." "It was," Warren said bitterly. "Bank owns it now. They'll sell it to the corporation for pennies soon enough." "Maybe not," Jed said. He reached into his shirt pocket, the one he kept his small notepad in. He took out a pen. "I went to the bank last week, made them an offer on this 160. Cash, they took it." He tore a piece of paper from the pad and started to write. "I'll rent it to you. You can live in the house. You can work the land. The rent will be 1/3 of the crop, just like in the old days. No papers from a lawyer, just my word and your handshake. You can start over, start small, start right." Warren stared at him, his mouth open, speechless. He looked at the piece of paper Jed was holding out, a simple, handwritten agreement. He saw not pity, but respect. He saw not a handout, but a chance. A profound, shuddering sob escaped him, the first crack in the dam of his broken pride. He reached out a trembling hand, not for the paper, but for Jed's, and he shook it. The years that followed were quiet. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the landscape and the community. The survivors were leaner, tougher, and wiser. Jed Stone became a quiet legend. The farmers who remained, the ones who had weathered the storm, started stopping by his shop. They didn't come to talk about grain prices or government programs. They came to ask how to rebuild a transmission, how to set the valves on an old diesel, how to make things last. Jed never charged for his advice, only for the parts if he had them. His shop became the new heart of the community, a place where the old ways were remembered and preserved. Jed never bought more land. His 320 acres and the 160 he rented to Warren were enough. He and his wife lived comfortably, their future secured not by a stock portfolio, but by a paid-for farm and the interest from the savings bonds he had bought when everyone else was buying new tractors. His grandson, a young boy named Michael, grew up in the shadow of the Big Bud. He spent his childhood in Jed's shop, learning the difference between a box end and an open-end wrench, the smell of diesel fuel and clean oil, the satisfying heft of a well-made tool. Jed taught him how to read a micrometer, how to listen to an engine, and diagnose a problem by its sound. One warm evening in the late 1980s, Jed was sitting on an upturned bucket by the shop door, watching Michael, now a teenager, grease the articulation joint on the Big Bud. The tractor's yellow paint was faded and chipped, but its engine was as strong as ever. "Grandpa," Michael said, wiping grease from his hands with a red rag, "why didn't you ever buy a new tractor? After the crisis, when things got better, you could have bought anything you wanted." Jed looked out at the setting sun, which was painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. He watched the light catch the dust motes dancing in the air of the shop. "Because we never needed one," he said, his voice slow and thoughtful. "This one does the work, and more important, we own it. It's not ours because a bank says it is. It's ours because I paid for it with my own money, and I fixed it with my own hands." He stood up, his old joints creaking, and laid a hand on the tractor's massive fender. The steel was still warm from the day's work. "Remember this, Michael," he said, his eyes meeting his grandson's. "Debt is a phantom. It promises you the world, but it owns your soul. It makes you a servant to the good times. This He patted the heavy fender again, the sound a dull, solid thud. This is freedom. This steel doesn't care if the price of corn is $2 or $5. It doesn't care what the interest rate is. You take care of it, and it will be here, ready to work, long after all the bankers and politicians are gone. You build your life on something real, on land you own, on iron you can fix. That's the only harvest that truly matters. The old man turned and walked slowly toward the house as dusk settled over the fields. Behind him the big bud stood silent and immense, a monument of faded yellow steel, its deep engine quiet for the night, waiting for the dawn. Its shadow stretched long across the farm, a dark, solid shape against the fading light, a promise of the work and the wisdom that would endure.